Hi everybody, welcome to our Woods for Nature case study webinar. We'll just wait for everybody to join, so we'll give it a couple of minutes and then we'll start. I can still see a few more people are joining, so we'll give it one more minute and then we'll kick off. Okay, well, we'll make a start. I think a few more people might still be trickling through, but we'll kick off. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Broughton Hall Woods for Nature case study webinar. I'm Caroline Sinclair, one of the promotion specialists here at the Forestry Commission. So today's session is being presented by Professor Alastair Driver and will last approximately 25 minutes, after which I'll give you a brief overview of the grants and support available for woodland creation from the Forestry Commission before moving on to the Q&A session. So to ask any questions, please type them into the Q&A channel in the Teams live event and we'll pick them up from there. And to help us prioritise the questions it will be most helpful for you to have answered, please can you use the like button to flag them, and then we will try and pick out the ones that are most popular, because it's possible we won't be able to get through them all. Also on the call today from the Forestry Commission is Mark Stevenson, who's a Nature Recovery Principal Advisor in our Policy and Advice team, and Andy Down, who's our Woodland Creation Officer for the East and East Midlands area, and they'll be here to try and answer any general forestry related questions you may have. Just to let you all know, I think there's already a question in the chat about this. We will be sharing the recording afterwards, so anybody who is registered will receive a link to that, and we will also be sharing it on social media for anybody who hasn't registered. Finally, just to let you know, a slight difference between Teams and Teams Live is that there's often a small delay when we transfer between one speaker to another. So if it suddenly goes quiet or dark for a couple of minutes and you wonder what's going on, don't worry, that's just how the platform works. So I'm going to hand over to Alastair now. I hope you enjoy his presentation and I'll pick up afterwards. I'll speak to you then. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, which is all about the Broughton Hall estate case study, which is a very large estate near Skipton in Yorkshire. And I am going to, first of all, in this presentation, talk to you a bit about rewilding, because I need to set this case study in the context of rewilding, because nature recovery and rewilding is a primary objective for this estate. I'm just going to pause there to double check that you can see my cover slide, Caroline.
Yep, it's all perfectly clear. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Alastair.
Thank you. So Broughton is one of many sites in the country now which are embracing rewilding, but it's doing so in an extremely transformational way. It's probably, I mean, I know pretty much all of the major rewilding sites in England and Wales. I've been to most of them in the last few years, and there are more coming on stream all the time that I'm visiting. And I'd say this is probably the most interventionist of the lot. So it's pretty much at one end of the intervention spectrum, as I'll explain later. Now, I just need to give you a quick overview of rewilding. Many of you will have no doubt heard me blathering on about this before, but for those who haven't, just to as I say, to set this in context, rewilding is the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. But we need to understand that the word rewilding is a present participle. It's an ongoing activity moving in a direction towards the point where nature is taking care of itself. And it may be the case, it's very likely actually, that we won't get to that point for a very long time, if ever, where nature is totally taking care of itself at a very large scale in many of our sites. But the important thing to focus on is the journey in that direction. And the premise for why we need this is quite simply because we've lost so much nature in this country, and even our national parks are very, very poor compared with what they could be in terms of their richness for biodiversity. So we've got a very low baseline against which we need to work, and that's obviously through centuries of man's impact. The spectrum of rewilding is very important to bear in mind. This is all about moving in a direction. So this graph shows you management intensity in the vertical column and project size along the bottom. And at the moment, most of our protected sites, nature reserves, etc., are relatively small and are quite intensively managed. And rewilding sites, big rewilding sites, are large and relatively little managed. And it's moving in that direction of this arrow that we need to be thinking about. And even if we were just to move quite a lot of sites to the middle of that graph, to the center of that graph, that would be a massive step in the right direction in terms of biodiversity recovery and in terms of tackling climate change. Now, rewilding has a clear definition. It has an IUCN definition. Rewilding Britain has a very similar definition, and it has a set of key principles. So don't listen to those people who say, oh, it's meaningless, it means nothing, it's nebulous. There is a very clear definition set of principles. In my normal presentations on rewilding, I would go through these in a bit more detail, but I haven't got time today. But the most important one that I want to mention here is that people are key to this. Homo sapiens belongs in this environment just as much as any other species, and it's very important that these projects deliver benefits for people and society as a whole, as well as for nature. And my day job, as some of you will know, is Director of Rewilding Britain. I'm actually presenting this case study in a private capacity because I'm a private specialist advisor for the Broughton Hall estate. But in my day job, I work with Sarah King and others to help develop the Rewilding Network, which you can access via the Rewilding Britain website. And that is, we've only been running this for a couple of years, and it's already got over 70 member projects on it, of which Broughton Sanctuary, as it's called, is one. So anyone out there who is involved in land management at scale, ideally over 100 hectares, please do get in touch if you'd like to consider joining that network and even becoming a case study. We've got over 1,000 landowning members now on that network, and it's going from strength to strength. And the other thing to point out here is that you may see in social media, etc., oh, it's all about rich estates. Well, actually, it's not. Approximately a quarter of the land holdings that are rewilding in England and Wales, for which I have data for 50 sites on behalf of Rewilding Britain, covering over 40,000 hectares. Approximately a quarter of them are private estates, large private estates, and that is roughly proportionate to the amount of rural land that is owned by large private estates. So it's at the moment, at this point in time, it's about proportionate. And you will see at the bottom that a smallish number, about a third of these, yes, a third of these sites are upland sites, and about 2/3 are lowland sites. And for it's borderline at Broughton, but I classify Broughton as an upland site in this context, but it's probably the most borderline of all the sites between upland and lowland situations. And the other thing I want to stress in terms of rewilding is that because our land and water is so degraded, and because we have a climate emergency and a biodiversity crisis, those words mean we need to act fast. We can't sit back and wait in every case. There will be some sites where it's very much passive rewilding, but the vast majority of rewilding projects in this country involve active rewilding, and that means interventions. And so far, through the data analysis of these 50 sites, we've recorded nearly 30 different types of intervention. And these ones that I've listed here are the most popular of the intervention types. And the first thing to say is that I would expect every single site to be allowing natural regeneration of vegetation, because if you're not, then you're not rewilding, because you're not allowing natural processes to prevail. But you can see a list of other very popular interventions, and you can see tree planting in that list. Now, I should stress that natural regen should always be the default option, but in northern Britain, in more hostile natural environments, particularly in landscapes with very few trees and very low diversity of tree species, then planting is entirely reasonable. And what we usually see is a mix of natural regen and planting, which is indeed the case at Broughton. So moving on to Broughton then, first of all, the location. Well, it's just west of Skipton in West Yorkshire. The A59 actually bisects the estate. So many of you in that part of the country will have no doubt seen large amounts of tree planting going on either side of that road. The site itself is about 3,000 acres, 1,200 hectares in size. And this is my crude mapping of the boundary by hand the other day. I was interested to see it's actually larger than the footprint of Skipton, which I wouldn't have guessed it was. So, quite a significant site. And on that site, we have about a third of the estate planned for rewilding at this point in time, sitting alongside fairly intensive sheep and dairy, and hopefully that agriculture will move in a more nature-friendly direction over time. And the rewilding area itself we are planning around 300 hectares of woodland, scrub and wood pasture, and we're well on the journey, as I'll explain now. So what are the drivers at this on this estate for rewilding? Well, this is a view from a patch of moorland on the southern border of the estate, looking down towards the River Aire floodplain and Skipton. And you can see that the fields in the foreground have been very intensively sheep grazed with classic. It's actually outside the Yorkshire Dales National Park, but it's classic Yorkshire Dales scenery with dry stone walls and very bare, short, intensively grazed grasslands. And so clearly there is quite a long way that we could go towards improving the biodiversity value of this site, but also because of the nature of the site on sloping ground in the upper part of the Aire catchment, quite a lot we could do for flood risk management, water quality, carbon sequestration, etc. And really the main drivers are the landowners themselves, Roger and Paris Tempest. Roger's family have incredibly owned this land for over 1,000 years, and Roger wants to. He describes himself as a custodian of the land. He wants to leave it in a better place for people and wildlife for future generations. and Paris too. Now, Paris also runs a health and well-being centre on the site, so there are strong links between nature recovery and health and well-being in this particular case. And I first met Roger only less than 4 years ago. I was invited to go and see him in my Rewilding Britain capacity to talk about rewilding for the first time, and it was clear that he was genuine and passionate about this, but also, you know, it needs to be economically viable. If he's going to switch from, as we are with these rewilding areas, grazing licenses and the income that provides, to a nature recovery, then, you know, he needs to make sure that it fits in with the economic model of the estate. And he's always had very significant ambitions for tree planting and woodland cover on the site. Just to put it in context, as I understand it, the UK tree cover figures around 13%, England's around 10%. On this estate, and indeed in the Craven Borough as a whole, it's around 6 or 7% tree cover. And actually, looking at the trees in the scattered trees in this landscape, you know, a lot of them you count the species on one hand in many areas. So you know, there's great scope for significantly restoring the amount of tree and scrub cover. And as I touched on earlier, there are also significant flood management issues related to how that land's being managed. You know, we have these images of sheets of water running off compacted soils on the slopes in recent years through intensive prolonged sheep grazing. And generally speaking, you know, there's no reason why one can't have sheep in a rewilding landscape as long as they are not impacting on natural processes and biodiversity. So generally speaking, what we see across the country with rewilding projects is that they are moving from large numbers of sheep for prolonged periods in the same places to small numbers of cattle roaming over bigger areas. That is the general trend for rewilding projects, and those cattle are essentially proxies for formerly native aurochs, etc. that we would have had. We don't have bison, elk, beaver and boar in most places. We don't have the ancient aurochs and tarpan, etc. So we're looking for proxies to try and get as close as we can to restoring natural processes. So that is something that in time this project will deliver. The team, well, the team consists of a range of expertise. Just quickly going around the table here, we have Wayne Scurrer, who's overseeing the tree planting projects as a contract manager. We've got myself, we've got Kelly, who I believe is on this call, who is overseeing the overall nature recovery work at Broughton, based at Broughton. There's Paris, there's Toots, Richard Tootill, whose team managed the grounds of the estate. Richard Preston, landscape architect, Matt Taylor, woodland advisor, and Roger himself. And together that team have done the bulk of the work for the estate, making all of what I'm about to show you happen. Now, it's one thing having an ambition and an idea, but it's another thing altogether securing the funding. And this is a really, for me personally, this is a really nice circular outcome here, because I was involved on behalf of Rewilding Britain in lobbying government to increase the amount of funding for landscape scale nature recovery to help mitigate climate change. And that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And I was told that effort, the national petition we ran, which secured over 100,000 signatures, the parliamentary debate, which we briefed ministers for, that led directly to the creation of the Nature for Climate programme, £640 million programme. And as part of that programme, a Trees for Climate package has been established. And that has turned out to be the major breakthrough in terms of funding for the Broughton project. Excuse me. So this programme of work is hosted by the White Rose Forest, and they have been a key player in making it happen. So Trees for Climate is was a £12 million programme. White Rose Forest is the community forest for North and West Yorkshire, and Kirklees Council actually hosts the White Rose Community Forest Trust. Guy Thompson is the programme director there, and Ewan Downey is the project manager for the trust, and he's been a key contact for the estate. The other another key aspect of funding, which I'll touch on at the end, and it relates to this major tree planting exercise, is the River Aire Catchment Natural Flood Management Programme. This is aiming to implement natural flood management interventions in the upper catchment to help reduce flooding further downstream, particularly in Leeds, and that is administered by the Environment Agency and other partners. And we've managed to access funding there. And also there's a join up, fantastically, a join up between different bits of DEFRA, which, you know, for so many years when I was head of conservation for the Environment Agency, I was always whinging about the lack of join up. Well, actually, we do have join up here where, for example, this programme of work is funding aeration in the phase 2 and phase 3 areas of the tree planting programme, which is itself funded by White Rose Forest. So we do have some good partnership working here. So if you remember, I said, you know, I first met in May 2019 with Roger just to discuss the concept of rewilding and what kind of interventions might be appropriate. He was already wanting to implement significant tree planting, and we very quickly got into a major first phase of work. And this is focused on areas within the estate which were under grazing licenses. So there were mainly sheep farmers who had a range of sites inside and outside of the estate where they grazed their sheep. The other occupiers of the estate are tenant farmers who have long-term multi-generational licenses. So negotiating on those is much more complicated and will take time. Some will want to move in that direction, others won't. That's fine. We'll have a mix of land use types. But in this particular case, all of these locations were essentially grazing, annual grazing license locations where sheep grazing stopped. And very quickly we moved into this program of work with basically zonation of species from high forest through intermediate to scrub and open ground. And you can see the data here on, you know, the grant requirements for the number of stems per hectare and the total plan for that first phase of 167 hectares to be planted in these green blocks with yellow blobs in them. And you can see the mix of species there, and there was basically feathering and blending between the zones, which we wanted to do. You know, to try, it's very difficult with such large scale planting to make it look natural and appear natural. But as I'll explain in a minute, you know, over time we will be doing that. Very importantly, the preparation for this involved mechanical screefing. Now, when you're dealing with something on such a scale, you know, it has to be mechanical. You know, the amount of manpower required would be phenomenal. It was already tough enough to get the planting done in the time frame, but this mechanical screefing has turned out to be really important in terms of the survival of the trees and their growth rates. And I'll come back to that in a bit when I talk about where we are so far. We didn't, unfortunately, have aeration done for this first phase of work. We didn't have the arrangements in place, but it has been done for the second phase and will be done now for the third phase, which is about to start. So the screefing involves, as you can see, basically scraping a strip of turf and folding it on itself, and then the planting is done in the scraped bare areas. Now it's interesting, I'm not an expert on woodland planting, but I know that some contractors like to plant the trees in the gap between the upturned turfs, and some like to plant in the mound of the upturned turf. Here it looks like they focus predominantly on planting between. You will see images like this on the Broughton website of volunteers planting, but that was, you know, a one-off or occasional, sorry, not a one-off, but an occasional activity to engage local community and businesses, etc., and schools in the exercise. But such a huge project with over, you know, well over 200,000 trees has to be done by teams of contractors, and indeed they were working flat out for at least 3 months to get this job done in early 2021. So less than 2 years after the first conversation, we had a huge number of trees in the ground. In terms of protection, we, you know, unfortunately we cannot get away from plastic tubes at that point in time. Things are changing, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But you know, we have deer, roe deer, we have hares, we have rabbits, we have voles, and it was made quite clear that, you know, because obviously I challenged this, it was made quite clear that unfortunately we will have to protect them from all of these browsing animals. I did insist on some being unprotected, a certain number we overplanted to allow for some to be unprotected, just to see how it goes. You know, with such a huge number of trees, I was hoping that a few might escape the attentions of browsing herbivores. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then for the scrubby species in the zones around the edges of the planting blocks, that's, you know, the willows and the thorny species, we use rabbit guards because it matters less that they are browsed. In fact, it's a perfectly natural thing for them to be browsed and send out lateral shoots and to, you know, help them become bushier over time. I just show you this slide as a bit of an aside, but whilst we were filming for Channel 4 News, which you saw some images of a couple of slides ago, in the distance there was more burning going on in the neighbouring estate, and I thought, oh, how ironic. You know, on the one hand we're trying to move forward on climate change mitigation and biodiversity, and then we got that going on next door. But you know, such is the way of the world. Hopefully more people will be acting in the way that Roger does, and over time less acting in the way that the neighbours are. I've always insisted on, of course, on natural regeneration being an approach where appropriate, and so we have identified areas for that. And in the first phase, that included a very large arable field where we deliberately didn't plant and allowing natural regen, and as expected, we are seeing the species that were in the boundary of that field, scattered trees in the boundary, ash, sycamore and hawthorn, starting to appear, but also actually a few other species are now coming in, including willows in the second year since we started. So that's moving in the right direction. And in the meantime, the herbaceous vegetation is of great interest and creating fantastic habitat for invertebrates, particularly. The unprotected trees, well, these are the ones that I insisted on having, I think in total about 5,000 of across the site. All the ones I looked at had been nibbled by hares. I guess the question is whether they are re-nibbled, whether the regrowth is nibbled to the point where the entire tree dies. Time will tell. But certainly in that first year, every single one that I found had been topped by hares. So here are the overall stats on what we've done and what we're planning to do on the site, and you can see, the first phase was really the major phase, 150 hectares and 10 hectares of natural regen in that field I mentioned. We then we then had to carry over some of the planting because we literally could not get hold of enough trees of certain species. So 17 hectares from the first phase was carried over and done in the second winter, along with another 16 hectares. And now in phase 3, literally starting very soon, we're planning a small amount of woodland planting akin to the first and second phase. But we've been through the EIA process again. We had to go through an EIA process, and indeed we obtained a woodland planning grant from Woodland Creation Planning Grant from Forestry Commission to help gather information for that, including information on breeding waders. And this does relate to an issue which, some people may want to ask questions about. Certainly I feel quite strongly about it. But the situation is in landscapes like this is that you do have breeding lapwing and curlew in these very bare sheep graze fields. But the presence of breeding waders in this situation doesn't necessarily mean it's a viable population. They are very faithful to the site. They keep coming back to the site to breed year after year. But unfortunately, what happens in situations like this is the crows just sit on the stone walls and predate them. And during the wader surveys for this third phase, which were carried out last summer, no chicks at all were found in a dozen or so breeding wader sites in the bare sheep graze fields. The only chicks that were found were down in the floodplain, which we're not planting and which we want to enhance. So there are constraints there, which I think the guidance does need tweaking, because I can understand why in the case of big Sitka plantations that there should be protection zones around them for breeding waders, no planting zones, etc. But in circumstances like this, these breeding waders are not delivering and contributing to the population because of the existing predation levels. And so actually making the site better for a much greater range of species, and indeed potentially for breeding waders in some of the more open rough grassland areas and the wetter areas, is for me, is an important consideration. But anyway, what happened as a result of that, those discussions, was that we've gone for 55 hectares of wood pasture instead of dense woodland planting, and I'm very happy with that. And indeed, the landowner Roger is as well, because we want these interventions to initiate a mosaic of habitat types across the site, and gradually over time then let nature lead more and more. So yeah, extensive wood pasture in this third phase, and indeed more fields which will be allocated for natural regen. And with all of that, we'll be well on the way to that original target of 300 hectares. Early observations. Well, what is really striking is that in some areas the trees have got away fantastically well. A lot of these were planted as a mix of cell grown and bare rooted, very small. Certainly cell grown ones, probably 20-30 centimeters. But they've shot away, and I'm absolutely certain that the screefing has played a major role in that, because it's meant we haven't had to do any maintenance at all around them, other than reinstating windblown tubes and stakes. And at the moment, we don't plan to do any maintenance, certainly no spraying, and at the moment, no hand maintenance either. So we've had, generally speaking, very good survival. First year, it was incredible, around 99%. It's dropped after last year to around 88%, but still perfectly acceptable in terms of maintaining the requirements for the grant, which is a 10-year grant, a 10-year contract commitment. So yeah, look, it's looking good in terms of survival rates. Sorry, just going back to that, and the other thing is the rough grassland. It's not the trees that are delivering the biodiversity at the moment. It's the incredible mix of rough grassland and herbaceous species. Now, nothing, there's not a lot in terms of particularly spectacular rare plant communities appearing, but certainly there's great habitat and structure for invertebrates and for voles, and as a result, we're seeing birds of prey like barn owls increasing, and so we've now got a program of installing bird boxes, etc. Some of the areas, the steeper slopes, which are no longer being sheep grazed, are wonderful, as you can see in the top left corner. And we've got a fantastic volunteer surveyor, David Coburn, who I believe is on this call as well, who is steadily recording the species across the estate. So there are some pockets of great floristic diversity. The moth numbers have gone through the roof. I do moth trapping up there. I'm now catching, as I did last summer, catching 500 to 1,000 moths in a single trapping session in the same locations where prior to this I was catching in very similar weather, same time of year, same conditions, 10, 20, 30 moths. So, you know, a huge increase in bioabundance. And one species that's appeared in great numbers, huge, there's literally hundreds of wall butterfly on the site now, which we hadn't seen beforehand. So even in these first 2 years, lots of very encouraging change, but not necessarily related directly to the trees, but definitely related to this process of restoring a more natural system. In the future, well, we've got ideas for a beaver enclosure in one of the woodlands. We're about to embark on some pond creation as part of the Natural Flood Management Programme. We've already introduced a range of leaky dams in the streams running down the steeper slopes. A little bit of wildflower sowing in some deculverting areas. And we want to work to restore. The next phase would be hopefully to enhance the floodplain in terms of its value for wetland birds and wildfowl, etc. Work with the Wild Trout Trust and the Rivers Trust, hopefully on some riparian improvements, riparian planting, etc. That's for the future. We've still got this major block of work to undertake this coming spring. So that's the story so far. It's, as I say, you know, don't think that all rewilding projects are like this. This is an exceptionally transformational one, but so far the results have been really exciting, and I would encourage you, to take a visit. You can visit the site. There's a cafe on site, a very good cafe on site. You can walk on the roads through the site, and there are public footpaths crisscrossing it. So I'll stop there and await any questions. Thank you.
That's great, Alastair. Thanks very much. That's fascinating. We're just going to wait for the slides to switch over. I'm going to run through the grant support that we offer very briefly. I'm not an expert in our grants, but I'm just going to signpost you to where you can find support and information about grants. So we have the Woodland Creation Planning Grant, which is a fund that helps support the costs of work that needs to be undertaken to plan woodland in the first place. Our flagship grant is the England Woodland Creation Offer, which has funding for capital and annual maintenance payments for woodland creation. There's a Forestry England Woodland Partnership Lease Scheme, which allows landowners to lease their land for a period of time to Forestry England for woodland creation. And as Alastair mentioned, the grants are also available from community forests and the National Forest. Forestry Commission has an option for you to sign up to e-alerts to receive information on grants, and the link is here in the slide, so you can receive that when the recording is circulated. And if you'd like to sign up, you can get updates, regular updates on how the grants will develop. If we can have the next slide, please. Other resources on gov.uk, there is a woodland creation overview page, which signposts to most of the grants and has other useful information on funding and resources to support woodland creation. We have a guide to planning a new woodland in England, and there is a leaflet which accompanies the Woodland Creation Planning Grant and the UK leaflet for the grants that I just mentioned. We have the next slide. There's also information about how income can be generated from the sale of carbon units. The Woodland Carbon Code and the Woodland Carbon Guarantee both give you information about that. And there's also a grants and incentives overview table, which kind of summarises at a glance the grants and supports that is available. And then finally, and Andy is one of these lovely people, though you can contact your local woodland creation officer, and you can do that at a national level by having a look on gov.uk for all their contact details, or for more general support, each area team does have its own email contact, and you can find those in this slide. So I'm going to move on to questions now. There's a few. I think most of them are aimed at you, Alastair, so I'm going to start at the top and work my way through. Question here about breeding waders, and I know you spoke a little bit about this in the presentation. Most of the tree planting happened before the breeding wader guidance was released. Did you establish the risk to breeding waders prior to planting, and to what extent? Did you face much pushback from NE or RSPB, so Natural England or Walls of Sound Protection of Birds. I know you've answered some of that, Alastair, but I don't know if you want to pick up on the latter part about engaging with those agencies.
No, there's been no pushback that I'm aware of. The only discussions we've had are, or I've had personally, are with Natural England, making the point that I made in the presentation, that just because waders are breeding there doesn't mean they're delivering productivity in a sustainable population. In fact, quite the reverse, they could be acting as a sink. And why not focus on restoring for nature at scale in these areas, and try and restore for breeding waders in more suitable areas like the River Aire floodplain, which is exactly what we intend to do. Now, as I say, we've reached a compromise in terms of wood pasture in this third phase, and for me that's a good result. We're all very happy with that. I'm not sure, I didn't have the same conversations ahead of that first phase, so I'm not sure whether the same process was gone through, to be honest. Forgive me, I wasn't directly involved in the discussions on that first phase of planting, but possibly it wasn't, because there are trees planted in virtually identical areas to those where we've been told we can only do wood pasture. So I suspect it's because of this more recent guidance that the rigor on that has increased. But like I say, I think we've reached a good compromise, and I think, you know, hope other sites are able to do that as well.
That's great, thank you. Question here about planting mechanisms. The planting with the mechanical screefing is very regular in pattern. Do you think there would be a way to get more random planting patterns at scale with the screefing? Yeah,
it's a really tricky one, this, and it's one that we work really hard on. You at that kind of scale, if you've got to use a machine to do the screefing, and there's a machine has to go in straightish lines for it to be, unless you want to spend years doing it. So unfortunately, we have these sort of contour following curvy lines. But but also don't forget, it doesn't show it very well in the images. But what we did was leave gaps. It's 80% cover, so we got 20% gaps in and amongst, and we left these gaps randomly, and the gaps were chosen, according to various factors like keeping certain views open, keeping patches of more interesting flora intact, avoiding any other features of interest. So there are a lot of gaps in and amongst that planting, but you don't necessarily pick it up when you're looking at huge scale images like the ones I showed. However, as hopefully you gathered from the more recent images, already that uniformity is starting to disappear in the landscape. Now, the one thing I didn't talk about is the future management or intervention that may come, and we are, in time, we will have rare breed cattle, for example, back in that landscape. Not necessarily everywhere, but in some parts of it. And there are already, as I said, there are native herbivores there anyway. So we will start to see over time that landscape becoming more of a mosaic and less uniform. But it is, it's a big challenge, to avoid that in the first couple of years when you're dealing with such a big project.
Yeah, thank you. Question about natural colonisation. Are you accepting any species, or are you managing for certain percentages of certain species and managing non-native regeneration? What is non-native is a whole other conversation, but interested in take on species such as sycamore.
No, we're not. The simple answer is no, we're not managing for non-native species. My good friend Ted Green would describe sycamore as Celtic maple, and we're quite happy to have that in the landscape because there are so few trees, as I said. We will be. There are one or two conifer plantations enclosed by walls that we will be felling, using the timber on the site, using the timber locally for fuel. And replacing them or allowing natural regeneration of native trees into those areas. But apart from that, we have no significant issues with non-native species. And I just say a little bit more about this because when I was head of conservation for the EA, I had a key role in developing an invasive non-native species strategy with colleagues. And there are some species where you definitely have to act. But I would say when you're dealing with a landscape of this kind of scale, this is another key point about rewilding. You can afford to be less prescriptive and less interventionist as time passes. And it's only if you have significant impacts on natural processes or on particular high value, rare species that I would say one would want to intervene in this kind of rewilding context.
Thank you. A couple more questions on a similar theme around the planning of your woodlands. Did you consider varying the planting density over a standard forestry plantation layout, creating a mosaic habitat structure? Sorry, that's just moved over a uniformed matrix, or not beating up to break up layout, or does the contract dictate this prescription?
Well, the scale, as I've already touched on, dictates the mechanical screefing process, which is, obviously screefs at regular intervals. So it's sort of controlled by that, but we have to achieve a certain percentage of survival after 10 years. And as far as I know, 80% is acceptable. We're at 88% at the moment. We're probably through the toughest bit. But the we tried to create this patchiness by leaving random, open, unplanted areas within the planting plots, and also, as I touched on earlier, having this feathered zonation between different mixes of tree species. So, given the scale and the constraints of time, I think we've gone as far as we can on that. It's not ideal, but when you're dealing with these big projects, it's hard to do things perfectly in terms of naturalness.
Yeah, a couple of questions about protection. Was deer fencing considered over tree tubes? Did you use any herbicide to control grass growth? Another question, were biodegradable tree shelters considered? Right.
All very important questions, and all, yes, things that we've talked long and hard about on the project. Deer fencing, sadly not practical because you're dealing with lots of discrete individual parcels of land. So, well, it's not affordable because you've got the main A road bisecting the site, and then either side of those roads you've got these patches of not necessarily directly connected fields because of the grazing license versus long-term tenancy arrangements. So we could only do it on grazing license fields. So you'd have loads and loads of enclosed parcels of deer fencing, which would be massively expensive. So that took it out of the affordability range. Another question was about biodegradable tree guards, and yes, we've been heavily involved in trying to move away from plastic. I've met with the managing director of Next Gen Tree Shelters, who produce these cashew nut oil and sheep wool Next Gen tree guards, and we will be utilizing a lot of those in this third phase of planting. They weren't manufacturing at the scale we needed at the time for the first and second phase, but I understand they are now, and yes, we're going to be trialing those. They are degradable, although one would imagine that you'd still want to remove them because they're still visually, they look very similar to brown plastic. So I suspect you still want to remove them from the landscape after they've done their job.
One of the questions is there a plan as to what to do with them once they've been removed at the end?
Yes, Matt Taylor, the woodland advisor, insists that he reuses his tree guards. So he cuts them carefully down the join, or where the ties are, and he reuses them. Now at this scale, I'm not sure that would happen, but you can certainly recycle them as recyclable plastic, and that will be done in due course. Yeah.
Back to the deer. What consideration and effort has been given to sustainable deer management on the estate? Has there been deer management infrastructure included in the design stage of the new woodlands to enable sustainable deer management to take place over the lifespan of the woodlands, improving the health and welfare of the deer and mitigating risk from deer in the future?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot to answer the herbicide question that was just now. I did actually say it in the talk, with no herbicides. We're not using any herbicides, and we're not doing any maintenance, and that is, that's a rule. We're not using herbicides. Deer management. I've met with the deer management group at Broughton to discuss it. At the moment, it's not a major issue. We're talking about small numbers of roe deer on the site. And quite frankly, you would expect, of course, this coming from me, I want to see some of the trees and shrubs browsed as they would be in a natural woodland environment. So we are already seeing deer browsing on those trees, those scrubby, thorny and willow species that only have rabbit guards. We're already seeing deer browsing, not a problem. We can live with that. As long as it doesn't get to the point where it's destroying huge numbers of trees and we can't meet the grant requirements, we're okay. And at the moment, I have no reason to think that we need to be concerned at this point in time. If and when things change dramatically, then we'll decide how we respond.
Right, thank you. Question about the historic landscape. What consideration was given to historic landscape? Were impacts on archaeological deposits considered? Was there any discussion regarding the impact on the setting of the listed buildings and the designed landscape around the hall?
Yes, we've entirely avoided the central part of the estate, which is registered parkland. So the planting is away from that area. And interestingly, actually, as I understand it, quite a lot of the sheep graze grasslands in and around the central part of the estate are in long-term multi-generational agreements. So I don't know, it's partly by default that actually the planting areas are further away from the central part of the site. We haven't got any significant scheduled ancient monuments. If we were, then we would have, of course, been required to avoid those. We have, in some areas, deliberately maintained views. So we've left some areas unplanted, or we've deliberately targeted the open spaces within the planting zones in those locations. So there's a little bit of tweaking gone on to accommodate landscape and views.
Brilliant, thank you. Question here about carbon. How was the carbon loss through the screefing process costed into the climate change benefits calculation?
I don't know the answer to that question. I doubt that there was a carbon calculation there. My view on this is that it's relatively insignificant. One would see in a natural landscape with wild boar and herbivore activity, etc., you would see a certain amount of rootling and exposure of surface carbon, but it's for a very short space of time. These areas vegetated up very quickly, but interestingly with different type of vegetation. Where I found most of the hay rattle, yellow rattle, was in the screefed areas where we'd exposed wildflower seeds that were buried below this compacted layer of the surface. So yes, there must be some carbon emission from this process, but I would say it's insignificantly small compared with the benefits of just stopping that really intensive large-scale agriculture across 300 hectares and moving to, don't just think about the trees and what they're delivering in terms of carbon. Think about the rough grassland and herbaceous vegetation that is suddenly appearing in that site in the space of a year.
I'm just going to pick up on another question which kind of ties into what you just mentioned about changing from a highly agricultural land. It's an exciting and ambitious project, but how do we square the need and desire to rewild with food security and the need for timber? Yeah,
probably the most popular question I get asked in my rewilding talks. Well, first thing to say is that this estate is actually typical of private estates that are rewilding. They're rewilding some of the least productive land, and they are doing it through agreements with changes of people who are ceasing farming or grazing license areas, etc. Typically it's only about a third of the land holding. So there's still a lot of intensive agriculture going on elsewhere on this land. So it's still producing food, and also it is typical of all rewilding projects in England and Wales at least, that they are or soon will be producing food themselves, because as I touched on in my talk, you need large herbivores in the landscape, and we haven't got these extinct species anymore. So rare breed cattle provide that, and if you're going to have rare breed cattle, why not use the meat from them? So that's what happens. The figures are 54% of livestock units on rewilding sites compared with farming beforehand. So it's not total eradication of food production. And the other important point I always want to make when answering this question is, don't forget, we waste 40% of the food we produce to eat. If we are really serious about food risk, food security, we've got to be making inroads into that 40%, because it is a disgraceful figure.
Why was the choice made to replant over allowing natural regeneration?
A range of things. First of all, there's only 6% tree cover in that landscape. You would probably wait 100 years or more to get the same amount of tree cover in that landscape, particularly bearing in mind you're dealing with very compacted soils. You're dealing with what would, if you just left it as we've shown, because basically you see what it would look like in and amongst the trees, it would turn into very long rank grassland, and it would be very difficult for tree seed species to have contact with the soil in that kind of condition. It would take a very long time. So in fact, we're the fields that we are allowing natural regen in the next phase, we will be scarifying those, or harrowing them even around the edges to allow trees from the boundaries to move into them. The second thing is that there are very few tree species on the estate, generally speaking. It's ash, sycamore and hawthorn predominantly. There are some others, of course, in the woodland pockets, but the variety is very low. And we've got, as I say, we've got climate emergency and biodiversity crisis. We can't afford to wait 100 years. This landowner wants to see transformational change in his lifetime, and he wants to see it, you know, as quickly as possible. So multiple reasons why it was appropriate in this case.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. We've run over a little bit. I think we've probably got time for one more question. So thank you to everybody for submitting your questions, and apologies for those we haven't been able to have time to answer. Well, the final question, Alastair, what are the perceptions of your neighbours of this work? Do you think you're going to have a ripple effect and see more of this happening in the area?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I've got, through my Rewilding Britain work, I've got data on this, what neighbours think of every project, and usually, excuse me, and usually it's a mixed bag. You know, so you'll have some that, you know, are quite enamoured by what's going on, excited by it. There are some that are sceptical, and there are some that are completely opposed. And I think, I'm pretty sure that's the case here. I showed you that example of moor burning going on a neighbouring landholding. I suspect they would be scowling at the thought of what's going on at Broughton. But the great thing is that the public generally are very supportive. There was a YouGov poll done by Rewilding Britain a couple of years ago, showed over 80% support for rewilding. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The key thing is that we've got to get government policies and funding mechanism changed so that we can incentivize more of this, because there's plenty of landowners out there wanting to do it.
That's great. Thank you, Alastair. Thank you for joining us, everybody. We're going to have to draw a line to it now. The webinar recording will be circulated. Apologies for the little black box that appeared in the corner of Alastair's screen. Not quite sure why that was. Time will tell whether or not it appears on the recording, but hopefully not. And thank you all once again for joining us.